when poor maid Emma accidentally walks in on billionaire Alex while he's bathing. His furious reaction sparks a chain of events neither could have imagined, filled with misunderstandings, hidden wounds, and unexpected love. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and rate this emotional journey from 0 to 10 at the end. Enjoy. The summer sun hung lazily over Manhattan, casting golden ribbons through the tall windows of the Sterling estate. From the outside, the mansion looked like something out of a magazine. Immaculate gardens, marble fountains, and a driveway long enough to swallow the sound of the city. Emma Carter stood at the gate, clutching a worn leather bag, her palms damp despite the warm breeze. She had never seen a place like this before, and in that moment, she questioned whether she truly belonged here. Her clothes were neat but faded, her shoes carrying the dust of long subway rides and secondhand shops. The only thing she carried with pride was the hope that this new job could help pay for her mother's medical treatments. With a deep breath, she stepped forward, unaware that the day ahead would change everything she thought she knew about the world. Inside, the air smelled faintly of lilies and expensive polish. Emma followed Mrs. Gray, the long-serving head housekeeper, through a maze of hallways adorned with oil paintings and crystal sconces. The older woman's voice was brisk but not unkind as she explained the daily routines, pointing out which rooms were off-limits and which silverware must be polished by hand. "And whatever you do," Mrs. Gray added, her eyes sharpening, "do not enter the master's private wing without permission. Mr. Sterling values his privacy more than anything." Emma nodded quickly, her mind too focused on making a good impression to think much about it. She was still memorizing the layout when Mrs. Gray handed her a feather duster and directed her toward the library, promising to return later to check her work. The library was enormous, rows upon rows of leather-bound books rising toward a domed ceiling painted with clouds. Emma lost herself in the quiet rhythm of dusting, the soft swish of the feather duster against old pages, the muted ticking of a grandfather clock in the corner. She was careful with every movement, knowing each item here was probably worth more than her annual salary. After an hour, she stepped into the hallway to find the bathroom so she could wash her hands. The corridor stretched endlessly, with identical white doors and golden handles, and the gentle hum of the central air conditioning filled the silence. Somewhere, faint music drifted through the walls, a piano, smooth and haunting. Without realizing it, Emma followed the sound, thinking it might lead her to the kitchen where Mrs. Gray might be. The music grew louder as she turned a corner, her shoes clicking softly on the marble floor. She pushed open a slightly ajar door, expecting to find a music room. But instead, her breath caught in her throat. Steam curled in the air, and there, through the frosted glass of an opulent shower, stood a man, tall and broad-shouldered, the water cascading over his toned frame. For a split second, she was frozen, her eyes wide, her heart thundering in her chest. The realization struck like lightning. This was Alex Sterling, the billionaire owner of the estate. Panic seized her, and she stumbled backward, but the sound of her shoe scraping against the marble gave her away. The water stopped abruptly. A moment later, the shower door slammed open, and Alex emerged, a white towel wrapped hastily around his waist. His dark hair was wet, dripping onto his bare shoulders, and his eyes, sharp, gray, and unyielding, locked on her like steel traps. "What the hell are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice low but edged with fury. Emma's mouth opened, but the words tangled uselessly on her tongue. She stammered something about being lost, about looking for the kitchen, but Alex stepped forward, each movement radiating the authority of a man used to being obeyed without question. "This wing is off limits," he said, his tone cutting like glass. "And you've just violated the one rule everyone in this house knows. Get out." Emma's cheeks burned as humiliation washed over her. She tried to explain that she hadn't known, that she'd been following the sound of music, but his expression didn't soften. The steam swirled between them, thick and suffocating, making it harder to breathe. She clutched her feather duster like a lifeline, backing toward the door. "I'm sorry, sir," she whispered, though the apology felt useless in the face of his anger. Alex's jaw tightened, and he turned away as if dismissing her entirely. "Mrs. Gray will handle your termination," he said without looking back. Her heart sank. Her first day and she was already being fired. As Emma hurried down the corridor, her steps unsteady, fragments of her life flashed before her. Her mother's tired smile from the hospital bed, the overdue rent notice taped to her apartment door, the long nights spent wondering if she'd ever get a break. This job had been a chance, maybe her last for a while, and now it was slipping away because of a mistake she hadn't even meant to make. In her mind, Alex Sterling was exactly what people said he was. A man of wealth and arrogance, untouched by the struggles of ordinary people. The piano music still echoed faintly from somewhere in the mansion, but now it felt distant, unreachable, like a door she would never open again. Back in the library, she gathered her bag and coat, her hands trembling. Mrs. Gray appeared moments later, her expression a mix of concern and resignation. "What happened?" she asked, though Emma could tell she already knew. Emma shook her head, forcing a weak smile. "It doesn't matter," she replied, though inside, it mattered more than she could say. Mrs. Gray sighed and rested a hand on her shoulder. "Wait here. I'll speak to him. He can be difficult, but he's not heartless." Emma wanted to believe her, but the image of Alex's cold, piercing eyes burned in her mind. She doubted anything would change his decision. As Mrs. Gray left, Emma sank into one of the library chairs, staring at the patterns in the ornate carpet. She told herself not to cry, not to let this man see her weakness if he happened to walk in. Still, her throat tightened and her vision blurred. Somewhere deep down, beneath the shame and frustration, a spark of defiance flickered. This wasn't how her story would end. She didn't know it yet, but the man who had just thrown her out of his private sanctuary would soon find himself drawn back to her, in ways neither of them could have predicted. And it had all begun with one wrong turn and an open door. The silence in the library felt heavier with each passing second, as if the air itself had thickened around Emma. She sat rigid in the chair, her hands gripping the strap of her worn leather bag, the edges digging into her palm. Somewhere beyond the double doors, footsteps echoed down the hall, measured, deliberate, and unmistakably male. Her heart lurched, half expecting Alex to walk in and order her out without another word. Instead, the doors swung open to reveal Mrs. Gray, her face calm, but yes, holding a glint of quiet determination. Emma could tell by the way the older woman's lips pressed into a thin line that she had gone to speak to him. "You're not going anywhere just yet," Mrs. Gray said, her voice steady, but carrying a weight that made Emma's pulse quicken. Before Emma could ask, the housekeeper added, "Mr. Sterling will speak with you in the study." Emma followed Mrs. Gray through the corridors, each step echoing like a countdown to something inevitable. When they reached the study, Alex was standing near the window, his tall frame outlined by the soft afternoon light streaming in through the sheer curtains. He didn't turn immediately, but his posture was unmistakably tense, shoulders squared, arms folded across his chest. For a moment, the only sound was the faint rustle of leaves outside. When he finally looked at her, his eyes were sharp, but there was something else beneath the surface, a flicker of thoughtfulness that hadn't been there before. "Mrs. Gray tells me you need this job for your mother's medical bills," he said, his tone measured, almost detached. Emma's lips parted, but she hesitated, unsure if this was a trap, then nodded and replied that it was true, and that she hadn't meant to intrude. His gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, as though weighing something invisible in his mind. Then, to her surprise, he said, "I'll give you another chance, but under strict conditions." Emma's breath caught, the sudden shift in his stance almost disorienting. He stepped closer, his voice dropping slightly as he continued. "You are not to enter my private wing again, no matter the reason. You will finish your assigned duties on time without excuses. And you will understand that in this house, rules are not suggestions. They are the foundation of order." Emma swallowed hard, managing to answer with a quiet, "Yes, sir," though part of her bristled at his condescending tone. Still, the alternative, returning to her cramped apartment empty-handed, was unthinkable. Mrs. Gray handed Emma a revised schedule, filled with precise instructions and room assignments. The tasks were grueling: polishing the silver in the formal dining room, organizing the wine cellar, and assisting in the upkeep of the solarium. Yet, as she read through the list, Emma felt an odd sense of relief. She still had her job, and for now, that meant a roof over her head and a lifeline for her mother's treatments. When Alex dismissed them with a curt nod, she left the study with Mrs. Gray, the older woman whispering, "You're lucky, you know. He doesn't usually give people second chances." Emma forced a faint smile, though she couldn't help wondering why he had relented. The rest of the afternoon unfolded like a test she hadn't prepared for. Every task seemed to carry more weight, as if Alex might appear at any moment to judge her performance. In the dining room, the silver caught the light in sharp flashes as she polished each piece, her hands moving in steady circles while her mind replayed the encounter in the study. She could still see the way he had stood by the window, the faint crease between his brows when he mentioned her mother, and the way his voice had softened, if only slightly, when he granted her the second chance. It unsettled her, not because it was kindness exactly, but because it hinted at something she couldn't quite read. By early evening, she was assigned to the solarium, a glass-walled room filled with potted orchids and rare plants. The golden light of sunset poured through the panes, casting long shadows across the tiled floor. Emma knelt beside a row of delicate orchids, trimming dead petals and misting their leaves. The quiet here felt different, less oppressive than the library, almost calming. She allowed herself to breathe, to focus on the simple rhythm of her work. That was when she heard it again, the faint strains of piano, drifting from somewhere deeper in the house. This time, she recognized the melody, slow and mournful, the kind that clung to the air long after the notes faded. She hesitated, remembering his warning, then forced herself to keep working, the music tugging at her thoughts like an unanswered question. Later, while carrying a tray of linens back to the service area, Emma passed the main staircase and caught a glimpse of Alex descending, dressed now in a dark suit. His hair was perfectly styled, and his expression unreadable as he adjusted the cuff of his shirt. For a fleeting moment, his eyes met hers across the hall. There was no smile, no greeting, but there was also no coldness, just a steady, assessing look before he turned away and continued toward the door. The encounter was over in seconds, but it left her strangely unsettled, as if something unspoken had passed between them. By the time she retired to her small room in the staff quarters, exhaustion had settled deep in her bones. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed, pulling off her shoes and staring at the worn floorboards. Today had been a whirlwind, from humiliation in the morning to an unexpected reprieve in the afternoon, and she wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring. She thought of her mother's voice on the phone last night, warm despite the pain, and promised herself she would not lose this job, no matter how many rules Alex Sterling threw in her path. What she didn't know was that the rules themselves were only the surface, and beneath them lay a maze of unspoken fears, hidden scars, and a story that would pull them both into deeper waters than either expected. Night fell with a suddenness that felt personal, as if the city had flipped a switch and drowned itself in shadow, and the first thunderclap rolled over the estate like a threat rather than a warning. Emma finished folding linens in the service corridor while the rain pressed flat against the glass, and the air turned heavy with the metallic scent of a storm about to break something important. The lights flickered once, twice. A nervous wink from an old chandelier, and the security panel by the door beeped in protest before falling silent again. She thought of the list Mrs. Gray had left. Double-check the windows, unplug the delicate equipment in the solarium, keep the service stairwells clear, and told herself to move faster, because storms in this house felt like tests, graded by a man who never forgave careless errors. Somewhere overhead, a door thudded shut, and a distant piano chord trembled, as if a hand had lifted too quickly from the keys. The power sputtered, came back with a strained hum, and then everything went black, long enough for Emma to feel the weight of it on her skin. When the emergency lights finally flared to life, she heard the noise that didn't belong, the staccato buzz of an alarm buried inside the walls. She followed it on instinct rather than permission, turning left where she should have turned right, because a voice in her head insisted that alarms were not opinions. Down the main hall and past the marble busts she would never dare dust. The sound grew sharper, needling her pulse until she recognized it. It was the elevator alarm, and it was coming from the private wing. She stopped at the invisible border she had promised never to cross, because promises keep people fed and sheltered. Yet the alarm chopped through the silence again, tinny and urgent, like someone calling her name through a keyhole. Rain clawed at the skylight, lightning licked the edges of the floor like spilled mercury, and the small red diode above the elevator door winked in a slow, cruel rhythm. Emma pressed the intercom and heard a static rasp before a voice slid through, clipped and controlled, somehow colder for the strain beneath it. "System fault," Alex said, as if reading a report he refused to personalize. And then, after the briefest pause, he added, "Don't enter this wing. Call maintenance." She told him maintenance was off-site, the bridge was flooding, and the storm had already knocked out half the phones, while the backup generator groaned like an animal that hadn't eaten in days. There was a silence that sounded like pride fighting fear, followed by a single sentence that did not hide the truth. "The car is stuck between floors." She asked if he was hurt, and he answered no. Then yes. Then no again. Because honesty frays when oxygen runs thin and a childhood memory wakes up without permission. The alarm spat another metallic plea, and the lights dimmed to rust, and Emma felt the decision arrive like a hand on her shoulder. She crossed the threshold because a life mattered more than a rule, and because the day she let someone remain trapped while she stood obediently outside would be the day she could no longer look her mother in the eye. The service panel sat behind a framed landscape of a lake that had never seen rain, and Emma pried it open with a butter knife she had tucked into her apron for no reason that made sense until now. Inside, the schematic was a nest of labeled switches and one manual release lever, guarded by a warning that shouted about liability and training she did not have. She pressed the intercom again and told Alex to brace against the rear wall, to plant his feet wide, to cover his head if he could. And when he said, "You don't know what you're doing," she borrowed the steady calm her mother used on hard nights and said, "I know how to follow instructions." Another thunderclap shook the bones of the house. The generator coughed, and the alarm stumbled into a pitched whine that made her teeth ache. She wrapped her hand in a dry towel, hooked 2 fingers around the lever, and counted backward because counting makes brave things measurable. And on 2, the elevator shuddered like a waking beast. On 1, it dropped a handful of inches, then jammed with a metallic scream that scattered her thoughts like birds flushed from a wire. "Again," Alex said, the word a command he tried to make sound like consent. and Emma bit her lip and pulled, feeling the lever resist, then yield in a slow arc that dragged her shoulder out of alignment. Sparks stitched the edges of the panel and kissed her wrist in a hot, needling line, and a smell like burnt pennies threaded the air as the elevator eased down, until the seam of the door aligned with the floor. She jammed a screwdriver into the gap and heaved until the doors parted with a pained sigh, revealing Alex, pale in the emergency glow. One hand braced above him, the other clenched so hard his knuckles were bloodless. He stepped out carefully, his composure reconstructed at speed, and the first thing he did was check the hallway, as if witnesses might be hiding in the crown molding, because anger grows best when it expects an audience. Then he looked at Emma, at the towel blackened where the sparks had kissed through, at the raw welt lathering her wrist, and the anger shifted its weight without leaving the room. "You ignored a direct order," he said, and she answered that alarms outrank rules when the risk is a person and not a vase. And for a moment, thunder filled the silence between them so completely that neither had to pretend the conversation was about anything other than fear. He told her she had jeopardized the system and perhaps herself, and she told him he had been breathing too fast for the last 3 minutes, and that fear eats reason in the dark, which is why lights and people exist. A crack of lightning drowned whatever he tried to say next, and the generator hiccuped, then steadied, and the elevator groaned shut behind them, like a door that had finally remembered its job. Mrs. Gray came skidding around the corner with a flashlight and 3 apologies, her eyes taking in the scorch mark on the panel, the sliver of blood at Emma's wrist, and the too careful stillness of her employer. Alex accepted the towel she offered and wrapped it around Emma's hand without comment, his fingers efficient yet careful, as if meticulousness could disguise the tremor he could not quite banish. "Medical kit, solarium," he said, but the words were softer than commands and heavier than kindness, and Mrs. Gray nodded, already gone, because she understood that some rooms should be left to rewrite their own air. Emma told him she was fine, that it was only a sting, and he replied that stings infect when ignored, and she almost smiled because it sounded like an apology that had lost its map. He looked past her toward the dark mouth of the elevator, and then back at the welt blooming along her wrist. And something complicated moved behind his eyes, like a memory deciding whether to speak. They walked to the solarium together, not side by side and not quite apart, the storm drumming overhead with the dull insistence of a truth that has waited too long. The orchids tilted under the percussion of rain, while the emergency lights painted their leaves in a color that wasn't green, so much as endurance pretending to be beauty. Alex cleaned the burn with a practiced touch that suggested lessons learned for reasons he would not discuss, and Emma watched the way he focused on small tasks, as if precision could dam a flood that had started years ago. He said she had done well for someone untrained, and she said he had stayed calm for someone trapped, and they both pretended they were merely exchanging data points. When Mrs. Gray returned with gauze, Alex wrapped the bandage himself, and his fingers brushed the inside of Emma's wrist in a point of contact so brief it could have been accidental, if not for the way neither of them looked away. The storm began to move east, the thunder retreating to a grumble, and the house exhaled, its systems flickering into a steadier hum, as if the old place had decided to forgive them for surviving against procedure. Alex stood, the mask of control sliding back into place, and said that what Emma had done was reckless and necessary, and he would prefer she never be forced to choose between those 2 words again. She answered that she would prefer he never get stuck in an elevator again, and the corner of his mouth almost remembered how to be human before the moment folded itself neatly and put itself away. As he left, he told her the private wing would remain off limits, but that, effective immediately, she had access to the utility panels for emergencies, and Emma nodded, hearing the unfamiliar cadence of trust trying out a new language. When the door closed and the rain softened to a steady whisper, She sat among the orchids with her bandaged wrist throbbing in time with her pulse, aware that something had shifted. Not like a door slamming, but like a lock quietly turning on its own. The next morning arrived muted, as though the storm had taken the city's voice with it when it left. Sunlight slipped through the solarium's glass roof in pale ribbons, falling across the orchids Emma had tended the night before. Her wrist ached beneath the neat bandage, a dull reminder of choices made without permission. But the real echo of last night was Alex's expression when he had looked at her in the dim glow, a moment caught between command and confession. She worked in silence, sweeping fallen petals into a small copper pan, until Mrs. Gray appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee, her voice low but pointed. "You should know," the housekeeper began, setting the cups on the bench. "Mr. Sterling has his reasons for locking that wing, reasons that go beyond privacy." Emma asked what she meant, and Mrs. Gray's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in the kind of caution people use when they are stepping close to someone else's pain. "All I'll say is that years ago there was an incident. Something that made him wary of anyone crossing his boundaries," Mrs. Gray said, then added with a faint shrug, "It isn't my story to tell." Emma's curiosity flared, though she knew better than to push, yet the thought burrowed into her mind like a thread waiting to be pulled. By the time she finished her tasks for the morning, that thread had already begun to tug. The opportunity to pull it came sooner than expected. In the early afternoon, she was sent to the archive room, a place she hadn't entered before, tasked with cataloging a shipment of rare books Alex had acquired at auction. The room smelled faintly of cedar and old paper, and as she moved between the shelves, she noticed a large mahogany cabinet pushed awkwardly against the wall, its key still lodged in the lock. She told herself it wasn't her business, but the thought of locked spaces now felt different after last night's elevator rescue. It felt less like defiance and more like the universe setting a stage. She turned the key, and the cabinet door opened with a reluctant creak, revealing neatly stacked boxes labeled in Alex's precise handwriting. One of them bore a date, August 14th, 15 years earlier, and beneath it, a single word: incident. Her pulse quickened as she lifted the lid, finding a collection of photographs, newspaper clippings, and an old leather-bound journal. The photographs showed a much younger Alex, perhaps 17, his arm around a boy who looked like his twin, though the boy's hair was lighter, his smile brighter. The clippings told the rest of the story in fragmented headlines. Promising young pianist missing after charity gala. Sterling family offers reward. Search called off after weeks without leads. Emma stood frozen, piecing it together. The music she'd heard late at night. The way Alex had reacted to being trapped in the elevator. The unspoken weight in Mrs. Gray's warning. The missing boy wasn't just a friend. He was Alex's brother. The journal, its leather cracked and softened with time, confirmed it. Entries in Alex's early handwriting spoke of competitions, rehearsals, and a night when they had slipped away from the gala to explore the city on their own. The last entry was cut off mid-sentence, as if the pen had been pulled from his hand. Eli said he wanted to see the river lights even though... And then nothing. Emma's throat tightened, her heart aching for a version of Alex she had never met. One who laughed with his brother instead of building walls around himself. She closed the box carefully, placing it exactly as she had found it, though the knowledge she carried now felt too heavy to put back. Later that evening, the house was unusually quiet. Alex was in the music room, the door half open, his hands moving over the piano keys with a slow precision that made the melody ache in her bones. Emma lingered outside, unsure whether to step in, until he spoke without turning his head. "Most people don't know this piece," he said, his tone neutral, but lacking its usual edge. She stepped inside and replied that it sounded like something written for 2 players, and he nodded, the faintest shadow crossing his features. "It was," he said, "but I play both parts now." The statement hung between them, carrying far more than it said, and Emma felt the truth pressing at the edges of her tongue. She told him the music was beautiful, and he gave a small, humorless smile, answering that beauty was just another word for what's left after loss strips away everything else. She didn't mention the cabinet, the photographs, or the clippings. Not yet. But her voice softened as she said that losing someone changes the air you breathe, that it makes certain spaces unbearable. His eyes flicked to hers, sharp with surprise, then softened almost imperceptibly. "Some spaces aren't meant to be entered," he replied, though it sounded less like a warning now and more like a confession. The next chord lingered, his fingers pressing into the keys as if to hold the sound in place, and then he let it go, the room swallowing the silence. Emma stood there, the unspoken truth between them a fragile thing, knowing that one day the whole story might come out, and that when it did, it would change how she saw him forever. For now, she would keep what she'd found to herself, not out of fear, but out of a growing understanding that trust, like music, is built in measures, not taken in a single note. 2 days later, the rhythm of the house shifted, as if the walls themselves sensed an approaching storm that had nothing to do with the weather. Emma noticed it first in Mrs. Gray's briskness, the way the older woman moved with a clipped efficiency, ordering the staff to polish the silver twice to check the crystal for smudges no one would see. By mid-afternoon, the estate was lit more brightly than usual, and the scent of lilies and white roses filled the air. A scent Emma had learned was reserved for very particular guests. She was arranging fresh linens in the upstairs lounge when the front door opened, the sound sharp and deliberate, followed by the click of heels on marble. A woman's voice, smooth and honeyed, carried up the stairs. "Alex, darling, I've missed this place." Emma leaned slightly over the banister and saw her, a statuesque blonde in a fitted ivory coat, her smile as polished as the diamond bracelet flashing on her wrist. Alex stood in the foyer, composed but clearly on guard, his hands in his pockets as he answered, "Victoria, I wasn't expecting you." The woman laughed lightly, as if his words were an inside joke, and stepped closer to press a kiss to his cheek. Something in her eyes, sharp beneath the sweetness, told Emma this visit had a purpose far beyond catching up. Emma returned to her work, though her ears tracked the conversation like a wire drawn taut. She caught fragments, charity gala, mutual friends, "It's been too long," before Mrs. Gray appeared beside her with a muttered, "That one's trouble." Emma asked quietly who she was, and Mrs. Gray replied, "Victoria Hale. Old money, old history with Mr. Sterling, the kind that likes to come back when it's bored." The warning was enough to keep Emma cautious, but not enough to quiet the prickling unease along her spine. Later, in the dining room, she was setting out china when Victoria strolled in, her eyes sweeping over the table before landing on Emma with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "You must be new," Victoria said, her tone dripping with the kind of politeness that feels like an insult. "And young to be working here. Alex does have a way of selecting his staff." Emma forced a professional smile, answering simply that she was here to do her job. But Victoria's gaze lingered, as if weighing her, measuring her value against something unspoken. "Well," Victoria said with a light laugh, "I do hope you know how to keep your place. This house has a way of swallowing people who don't." Then she drifted away, leaving the scent of expensive perfume and a sharper warning than the words themselves. Dinner that night was formal, and Emma's duties kept her in and out of the room, pouring wine, clearing plates, refilling water glasses. She caught snatches of Victoria's conversation with Alex, references to trips abroad, shared investments, people Emma had never heard of, but who belonged to a world far from hers. Victoria leaned in when she spoke, her hand brushing Alex's arm more than once, though his responses remained cool, measured, and almost distant. At one point, Victoria mentioned the staff, glancing toward the doorway where Emma stood, and said, "I couldn't help but notice your new maid seems particularly attentive. You've always had a soft spot for a pretty face." Alex's jaw tightened, and he replied evenly, "Emma is efficient and professional. That's all that matters here." Victoria's smile sharpened, as if the answer had confirmed something she wanted to believe. By the time the dinner ended, the air between them hummed with an undercurrent Emma couldn't fully name, though she could feel its weight pressing in on her. It was later, as Emma was clearing the last of the dishes, that Victoria cornered her near the kitchen. "You know," Victoria began, her voice low enough to avoid carrying, "Alex has a habit of bringing people close, only to push them away when it suits him. I'd hate for you to mistake kindness for permanence." Emma replied that she didn't expect anything from him beyond her work, but Victoria tilted her head, her smile widening in a way that felt almost predatory. "Good," she said softly, "because I'd hate to see you hurt or dismissed." She left before Emma could answer, her perfume lingering like a shadow. The words clung to Emma long after she returned to her small quarters, settling in the corners of her mind, like dust she couldn't sweep away. She told herself it didn't matter, that Victoria was nothing but a relic from Alex's past. But part of her couldn't ignore the deliberate way the warning had been delivered. The next morning, Alex was distant. He did not explain, only brief instructions for her duties before disappearing into his study. Emma tried to focus on her tasks, but the change in his demeanor was impossible to ignore. When she brought in fresh coffee, she caught the tail end of a phone call, his voice low, clipped, speaking to someone about avoiding unnecessary attachments. He ended the call abruptly when he noticed her, thanking her for the coffee but not meeting her eyes. By noon, Mrs. Gray informed Emma she was to take the afternoon off, an unusual order that left her both relieved and uneasy. She walked the gardens to clear her mind, yet the image of Victoria leaning close to Alex at dinner kept intruding, tangled with the memory of his cool dismissal today. It wasn't until evening that the truth hit her. She returned to the house to find Victoria still there, her coat draped over the back of the sofa, her voice carrying from the lounge. "She's using you, Alex. You can't see it because you've always been susceptible to people who play the part of the innocent. But trust me, girls like that have an endgame." Emma froze in the hallway, the words cutting sharper than she expected, and then Alex's voice came, low but audible. "Perhaps you're right." It was a simple sentence, but it landed like a door slamming, and Emma felt the air in her chest thin. She turned away before they could see her, moving quickly toward the service stairs, telling herself she didn't care, that it was none of her business. But the truth was harder to swallow, that in a single evening, someone who barely knew her had planted a seed of doubt in Alex's mind, and he had let it take root. The rain had returned by morning, softer this time, a steady percussion against the tall windows of the Sterling estate. Emma kept her head down, moving through her duties with mechanical precision, her mind still replaying Alex's words from the night before. "Perhaps you're right." They clung to her like damp clothes, impossible to shake off. And every time she passed the study or the lounge, she half expected to find Victoria there, lounging in her perfect coat with that perfect, knowing smile. But Victoria was nowhere to be seen that morning, and Alex was equally absent, the air of the house strangely hollow without either of them filling it. Mrs. Gray noticed Emma's quietness, but said nothing, perhaps sensing that whatever had shifted between the master of the house and his maid was not hers to mend. By midday, Emma finished polishing the silver in the dining room and decided to escape to the solarium for a few minutes of peace. The orchids swayed faintly in the gentle drafts from the vents, their petals beaded with condensation, and Emma let the stillness soak into her. But even here, the memory of Victoria's voice, oily, confident, curled at the edges of her thoughts, reminding her of how easily doubt could be planted and how quickly it could bloom. Meanwhile, Alex was in the library, flipping through a ledger without reading a word of it. The conversation with Victoria had been meant to settle his mind, to reinforce the walls he built around himself. Yet it had left an aftertaste he couldn't ignore. He told himself he was being rational, that he'd known people like Emma before. People who seemed genuine until their needs outweighed their loyalty. But the thought didn't sit comfortably. By afternoon, his phone buzzed with a call from an old acquaintance, a fellow board member for a charity gala. The man mentioned, almost in passing, that Victoria had been inquiring about Alex's recent hires, particularly one young maid in his household. The phrasing made Alex's grip tighten on the phone, his pulse ticking faster as the man added that Victoria had been asking whether the maid might be vulnerable to suggestion if offered the right incentive. Alex ended the call politely, his mind now a hive of unanswered questions, each one stinging harder than the last. Later, in the main hallway, he overheard her. Victoria's voice drifted from the lounge, its edges sharpened by impatience as she spoke into her phone. "I told you, if we can get her out of the house, Alex will come back to his senses. He's too distracted right now, and it's affecting everything. His decisions, his investments, his focus." There was a pause, and then her tone turned dismissive. "No, she's not competition. She's a tool. Remove the tool and you remove the problem." Alex's jaw tightened as he stepped silently closer, the shadows of the doorway swallowing him whole. The conversation continued, Victoria chuckling softly as she said, "Once she's gone, I'll have him back on track. And when he's back on track, he'll remember why we've always been the perfect match." It was enough. More than enough. Alex stepped forward, and Victoria startled, ending the call with a sharp flick of her wrist. "Who were you talking to?" he asked, his voice low, but carrying a weight that made the question sound more like an accusation. Victoria recovered quickly, her lips curving into a smile that was meant to disarm. "Business," she said lightly. "Nothing you need to concern yourself with." Alex's eyes didn't waver, his gaze steady and unblinking. "You've been trying to get Emma dismissed," he said flatly, and when she opened her mouth to protest, he added, "I heard you." Her smile faltered, the mask slipping just enough to reveal the calculation beneath. "She's beneath you, Alex. You can't honestly tell me you don't see that." "I see someone who has done nothing to deserve your interference," he replied, his voice cooling further. "And I see someone whom I misjudged, again." Victoria's eyes narrowed, a flicker of irritation breaking through her practiced elegance. "You'll regret keeping her here," she said, her tone no longer sweet, but edged with steel. Alex didn't answer, simply stepping aside to gesture toward the door. There was a long pause, in which Victoria seemed to measure her chances. But in the end, she picked up her coat and left without another word, the echo of her heels fading into the drizzle outside. For a moment, Alex stood in the empty lounge, the quiet settling like dust around him, and then he turned toward the service corridor. He found Emma in the solarium, kneeling beside a row of orchids, her focus entirely on trimming away dead leaves. When she looked up at him, her expression was wary, guarded by the wall his doubt had built between them. "I owe you an apology," he said, and when she didn't answer immediately, he added, "I let someone else's opinion color my judgment. That was wrong." Emma studied him for a long moment before replying, It's easier to believe the worst when you don't know someone well. His lips twitched at that, a faint shadow of a smile. Then maybe I should make the effort to know you better, he said. And for once there was no command in his tone, just a quiet sincerity she hadn't expected. She nodded slowly, unsure what this meant for the days ahead, but certain that something had shifted again, this time in a way that felt less like a lock turning and more like a door opening. The day after Victoria's departure, the estate felt different, quieter, though not in the strained, watchful way it had been before. Emma noticed Alex moving through the house with less tension in his shoulders, his voice softer when he gave instructions, his eyes meeting hers without the guarded flicker she had grown used to. Still, the whirlwind of the past week had taken its toll on her, though she tried not to show it. Her wrist still throbbed faintly from the elevator incident, and a persistent fatigue had been creeping in, the kind that made her limbs heavy and her thoughts slow. By mid-morning, as she worked in the solarium, a dull ache settled behind her eyes, and the air seemed to press harder against her chest. She told herself it was nothing, a bit of exhaustion, maybe the leftover damp from the rainy weather, but the world tilted suddenly when she stood, and the orchid she had been tending blurred into a smear of pink and green. She steadied herself against the bench, breathing through the wave of dizziness, unwilling to admit how unwell she felt. But the weakness didn't pass. It deepened, pulling at her, until even the act of walking felt like wading through water. It was Mrs. Gray who found her first, kneeling beside the orchids with her hands limp in her lap, her skin pale beneath the morning light. "Emma." The housekeeper's voice was sharp with concern, and before Emma could wave her off, another figure appeared in the doorway. Alex's eyes swept over her with a kind of focus she had never seen in him before. Not the calculating gaze of a man assessing a problem, but the immediate, visceral concern of someone confronted with another's fragility. "She's burning up," Mrs. Gray said, pressing the back of her hand to Emma's forehead. "I'm fine," Emma murmured, though the words were paper-thin, stripped of conviction. Alex stepped forward, his presence filling the space, and without asking, he crouched to her level and said, "You're not fine. You can barely stay upright." When she tried to protest again, he slid one arm beneath her knees and the other behind her back, lifting her effortlessly. The movement startled her, but the steadiness of his hold kept panic at bay. Her head rested against his shoulder, and she caught the faint scent of cedar and rain on his coat. He carried her through the corridors without hesitation, past the curious glances of staff who had never seen him so openly engaged in someone's care. In his private wing, a place she had sworn never to enter, he set her down on a large, neatly made bed, the dark linens cool against her flushed skin. Mrs. Gray followed with a small medical kit, but Alex waved her toward the phone. "Call Dr. Reynolds. Tell him to come here immediately," he instructed, his voice clipped but laced with urgency. When they were alone, he pulled up a chair beside the bed, his eyes scanning her face, as if to measure the exact degree of her discomfort. "You should have said something," he said quietly, and she answered with a weak smile. "It's hard to complain when you're already lucky to be here." He didn't argue, though his jaw tightened slightly, and he reached for the cool cloth Mrs. Gray had left on the nightstand. The dampness was a shock against her overheated skin, but the relief was immediate, and she exhaled slowly. For a while, they sat in silence except for the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer. "I'm not used to this," he admitted, his gaze fixed on the cloth in his hands. "Taking care of people?" she asked, her tone light despite the fog in her head. "Letting people stay long enough that they might need me to," he corrected, and something in his eyes told her he meant it in a way that stretched far beyond the present moment. The doctor arrived within the hour, a brisk man with a leather case and the efficient air of someone who had worked with the Sterlings for years. He checked her temperature, listened to her breathing, and declared it a combination of fatigue and a mild infection. Nothing dangerous if treated promptly. Medication was prescribed, rest was ordered, and Alex accepted both instructions without question. Once the doctor left, Alex returned to his chair, setting the small bottle of pills and a glass of water on the nightstand. "You'll stay here until you're better," he said, leaving no room for argument. Emma started to protest, her duties, the other staff. But he cut her off gently. "The house can function without you for a few days. You can't function without your health." Over the next 2 days, he checked in on her regularly, bringing soup, making sure she took the medication, even adjusting the curtains to shield her from the brightest afternoon light. It was a side of him she hadn't expected, attentive without being overbearing, present without intruding. On the third evening, as she sat propped up against the pillows, he lingered by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "Do you ever think about leaving all of this?" she asked suddenly, surprising herself. He turned, considering her question. "I think about what I'd lose if I did," he said, "and what I've already lost by staying." She didn't press for details, but the answer carried a weight that settled between them, something unspoken yet understood. By the time she was strong enough to return to her quarters, the air between them had changed. The guarded distance that had once defined their interactions had thinned, replaced by a quieter, more deliberate connection. Emma felt it in the way his gaze lingered a second longer when he passed her in the hall, and in the way her thoughts drifted toward him when she was alone. Whatever had begun in the sharp edges of their first encounter had softened into something neither of them had intended, but both were reluctant to name. And though she didn't know it yet, that unspoken bond would soon be tested in a way that would demand more from both of them than either had been willing to give before. By the time the first signs of spring began to soften the sharp edges of winter, Emma had fully recovered. The Sterling estate, which had felt like a labyrinth when she first arrived, had become familiar territory. Its polished halls no longer intimidating, its rooms less like cages, and more like pages in a story she was unexpectedly part of. Her duties resumed, but the way she moved through the house had changed. There was a lightness to her steps, and she no longer kept her gaze fixed on the floor when Alex passed. He too seemed different, still meticulous, still carrying the quiet authority that came with his name, but less guarded, his eyes warmer when they met hers. The events of the past weeks had stripped away some of the distance between them, and though neither had spoken aloud what was shifting, it threaded through every interaction. It was Mrs. Gray who first hinted at what was coming, her voice laced with a smile as she mentioned an upcoming charity gala. "Mr. Sterling's planning something special for this one," she said, arranging flowers with deliberate care. Emma thought little of it at first, assuming it was simply another high-profile event she would help prepare for. But the undercurrent in Mrs. Gray's tone lingered in her mind. Preparations for the gala consumed the estate in the days that followed. Caterers arrived for tastings, florists unloaded arrangements by the truckload, and seamstresses bustled through the halls with garment bags in tow. Emma was tasked with overseeing the setup of the solarium, which would serve as the reception area before the main event. She worked late into the evenings, ensuring every tablecloth was pressed. Every crystal flute gleamed under the soft, golden lighting. Alex checked in more often than usual, not to critique, but to observe, his eyes lingering on the details she touched. Once, as she adjusted the position of an orchid centerpiece, he stood beside her and said, "It's perfect," in a tone so genuine it left her momentarily speechless. She thanked him quietly, and he added, "You have a way of making things feel alive." The words stayed with her, warming her in moments when the night still held a trace of winter's chill. The night of the gala arrived crisp and clear, the sky a deep velvet scattered with stars. Guests began arriving in sleek, black cars, their laughter spilling into the night as they were escorted inside. Emma worked in the background, moving between the reception and the main hall, ensuring everything ran smoothly. It was during one of these passes that she noticed Alex standing near the grand staircase, his tuxedo perfectly tailored, his posture effortlessly commanding. When his gaze found hers across the room, something unspoken passed between them. An acknowledgement, a silent thread pulling her closer. But she stayed at her post, reminding herself of her role, until Mrs. Gray appeared and pressed a champagne flute into her hand. "Go on," the housekeeper urged softly. Just for a moment, reluctantly, Emma stepped to the edge of the gathering, feeling slightly out of place among the glittering gowns and polished shoes. Midway through the evening, Alex took the stage to address the guests, thanking them for their generosity in supporting the new Sterling Foundation initiative. Emma listened from the side. Her curiosity piqued as he spoke about the foundation's mission to provide education, housing, and opportunities for those facing the kinds of hardships that often go unseen. Then, to her surprise, he said, "This initiative wouldn't exist without the vision and dedication of someone who knows firsthand what it means to face those hardships, and who has shown me more than I thought I was capable of seeing." His eyes sought her out in the crowd, and though her instinct was to step back, she found herself held in place by the sincerity in his expression. "I'd like to introduce the director of the Sterling Foundation, Emma Carter," he announced, his voice carrying through the hall. The room erupted in polite applause, and Emma felt a rush of disbelief as he gestured for her to join him on stage. Walking toward him felt surreal, her heart pounding against her ribs as she crossed the polished floor. When she reached his side, he leaned slightly closer and murmured, "You've earned this," before turning back to the guests. He spoke briefly about her work, her determination, and the integrity she had shown since coming to the estate, framing her not as an employee, but as a partner in this new chapter. Emma managed a few words of thanks, her voice steady despite the whirlwind in her chest. As the applause faded, Alex took her hand, not in the perfunctory manner of a formal introduction, but with a quiet assurance that felt deliberate and personal. The warmth of his palm against hers was a tether in the sea of faces, and when he glanced at her, there was no pretense, only the weight of shared history and unspoken promise. The rest of the evening passed in a blur. Guests congratulated her, some offering business cards, others sharing stories of their own. Emma felt both humbled and out of her depth. But each time she faltered, Alex was there, an anchor in the swirl of unfamiliarity. When the last guest departed and the staff began dismantling the decorations, she found herself alone with him in the solarium, the orchids still glowing softly under the overhead lights. "You didn't have to do that," she said, her voice low. "I wanted to," he replied simply, stepping closer. For a moment, neither spoke, the space between them charged with the weight of everything unsaid. Then, almost as if drawn by something neither could resist, he reached for her again, his hand warm against hers. Outside, the first petals of spring blossoms stirred in the night air, drifting against the glass. Inside, Emma felt something shift. Not the cautious, tentative change of the past weeks, but a decisive turn, like stepping into sunlight after a long winter. She didn't know what the future would hold, whether this moment was the beginning of something lasting or simply a perfect intersection in their paths. But for now, it was enough. They stood together among the orchids, the scent of them mingling with the faint trace of champagne in the air, and the quiet certainty that happiness, however unexpected, had found its way to them at last. Thank you for joining us on this heartfelt journey between Emma and Alex, two worlds colliding, tested by doubt, danger, and the courage to trust again. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Did their unexpected happiness surprise you? And what moment touched you most? Share your feelings in the comments. Tell us where you're listening from, And don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Your support means everything, and we can't wait to see you in the next chapter.